Now I want to move up into the last area of the central nervous system that we are going to talk about, and that is the telencephalon. And the first area I want to look at associated with the telencephalon is an area called the basal ganglia. As we have worked our way up through the brain, from the brain stem, up through the diencephalon, etc., we have been looking at motor system controllers. So we've talked about the mesencephalic system, that being the substantia nigra, the red nucleus, the reticular formation, as being areas of motor system control. We saw that the cerebellum is a very, very important area of motor system control. But the highest centers of motor system control belong to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia was first described by a man by the name of James Parkinson. And in 1817, he published what he called an essay on the shaky palsy. We now know the shaky palsy as Parkinson's disease. And we're going to see that the basal ganglia are going to be areas that are going to be found in the cerebrum. And Parkinson said that there were three areas that made up the basal ganglia: the corpus striatum, the amygdala, and the colostrum. Well, what we're going to see as we work through this is that Parkinson was not 100% correct, but he also was not 100% wrong when he identified his structures. But the important thing was that even in 1817, Parkinson saw that these areas were very, very important in motor system control. One of the things that makes the basal ganglia really very hard to study is the terminology that is used when we talk about the basal ganglia. And so what I've done is I've kind of put together a little bit of a chart or a flow chart on this slide and the next slide so that we can define what the basal ganglia actually is. So as we look at this, we are going to see that there are two structures that we'll talk about in just a moment. The first is called the caudate nucleus. The second is called the putamen. These two structures together, based on their location, are going to form the dorsal striatum. A third structure is called the nucleus accumbens. By its position, we can call this the ventral striatum. And then, based on phylogenetic development, we can take the dorsal striatum, caudate and putamen, ventral striatum, nucleus accumbens, and we can call this the neostriatum. And the neostriatum is phylogenetically new in that it will be found only in the higher animals. Then we can kind of start all over. Based on its location, we have a dorsal pallidum. And the dorsal pallidum is going to have a medial and a lateral section. Based on the position, we can have a ventral pallidum. And the ventral pallidum is going to be made up of two very, very small little areas: the substantia innata and the basal nucleus of Meinhardt. The ventral pallidum plus the dorsal pallidum is going to form a structure called the globus pallidus. And that is going to form the paleostriatum, or the older part of the basal ganglia. So another way to look at this is If we take the caudate and the putamen and the nucleus incumbens, we can push these two together and we can form a dorsal striatum. By default, the nucleus incumbens becomes the ventral striatum. Then we can push those two together to form the neostriatum. So it's kind of like a convergent diagram. We can do the same thing with the paleostriatum, in that we can take the medial and the lateral, push them together into the dorsal pallidum. We can take the substantia innomita and the basal nucleus of Meinhardt, push them together, and form the ventral pallidum, push those two together to the globus pallidus, and then that becomes our paleostriatum. But we are not quite done yet. So now what we can do to continue this discussion is we can take the neostriatum with all of its structures, we can take the paleostriatum with all of its structures, and we can form a structure called the corpus striatum. And the corpus striatum, you may remember, was an area that Parkinson said belonged to the basal ganglia. But we aren't quite done yet. In that, we can take the corpus striatum with all of its structures. If we add the substantia nigra, the ventral tegmental area, and the subthalamus, we have finally defined the basal ganglia. So as you can see, the basal ganglia is not a single structure. It is a very, very large, involved area of the central nervous system. If we take this one step further, if we take all of the structures that we have just defined as part of the basal ganglia, and we add the reticular formation of the brainstem, if we add the red nucleus, we have now defined an area which is called the extrapyramidal system of motor control. And as you can see, this is a very, very extensive system. And this is why we as humans move in a reasonably coordinated fashion. We have a lot of structures that are controlling our motor systems. Then finally, and I'm going to draw a line across this like this, because finally then, if we take the putamen and we add the globus pallidus, based on the proximity of these two structures, we can form a lentiform nucleus. And again, I'll kind of justify that as we move through the rest of this discussion. So what I want to do first of all is I want to look at the neostriatum. And we said first of all that the neostriatum is going to be made up of the caudate nucleus. And the caudate nucleus is shown in this kind of light green color. Going from anterior to posterior, we are going to see that the caudate nucleus has a head, it has a body, and it has a tail. And as we look at it, we're going to see that there are no sharp lines of demarcation between these three different areas. But one way to look at this is we can say that the head is basically vertical, the body is basically horizontal, and then the tail is going to be, again, more or less vertical. The caudate nucleus is going to be found on the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. Then we're going to see an area right here, this oval-shaped area, And I'm going to change the name on this picture to the putamen. The putamen is found on the lateral side of the thalamus. And then finally, in between those two areas, so in between the head of the caudate and the putamen, this small little transition area, right there, this is going to be the nucleus accumbens. We are going to see that these three areas, caudate, putamen, and nucleus accumbens, are all going to work together in motor system control for turning and circling behaviors. If you think about it for a moment, if you're walking one direction and all of a sudden you make a 90-degree turn, think about all of the different muscles and all of the different systems, balance, vision, all of that has to be coordinated. That's what this area does. I wanted to show you this picture because it's a very nice illustration of how the caudate nucleus rests against the lateral side of the lateral ventricle. So notice, for example, the head of the caudate is going to be resting against the anterior horn. Then as we come back, the body is going to be against the body and the antrum of the lateral ventricle. And finally, the tail is going to come out into the temporal lobe in that lateral horn. So again, this is going to show us that, relationship very, very well. And then finally, as we look at the neostriatum, we can see the caudate nucleus here. We can see it then coming anterior, and we are then going to see the transition area, which is going to be our nucleus accumbens, and then we can see we flow into the putamen. Okay, so again, all of that neostriatum is continuous with itself.